If you're talking about organized crime in the United States, then there is no more prominent nor infamous group than the Mafia. With their various families, controlling different parts of the country, these ruthless gangsters had power like no other. But where did it all begin? What was the catalyst for the formation of the Mafia? How did they manage to obtain so much power in the first place? Let's find out the true story of Cosa Nostra. To understand the formation of the Mafia, we first have to look at another Italian word, which is mastro, which means boss. This is an old Italian word that goes back centuries. Back then, the term was used to refer to someone who was in charge of a group of laborers, such as a construction crew or a farmhand. However, there was one big difference between the boss then and now. See, the boss back then didn't get to be the boss by being elected or appointed. No, back then the boss was simply the person with the most amount of power and authority. In other words, the biggest thug. As time went on, this definition of the word expanded to include people who ran illegal organizations as well. And eventually it was shortened to just mafioso, which took on a meaning of its own, which referred to those involved in racketeering, extortion, and other forms of organized crime. These days, it's more commonly known as mobster. But when did this all start? If you're thinking 1920s New York, you're way off base. The truth is that the foundations for Cosa Nostra were laid in the island of Sicily many years before. You see, Sicily has always been a place of great wealth. It is, after all, an island filled with beautiful architecture, great works of art, and amazing food. Unfortunately, it's also had its fair share of problems over the years, especially when it comes to violence, oppression, and corruption. For many years, Sicily was ruled by monarchs, kings, and queens, but none of them really cared much for the welfare of their subjects. The main reason being that they never stayed in Sicily. They lived in the capital of Italy. So that meant that governing the island was left to local nobility, who would often do horrible things to their fellow Sicilians, such as stealing their land and beating them if they got out of hand. Now, normally people would turn to the government for help, but there was no use in that either. You see, the government wasn't exactly on great terms with the local population either. They kept raising taxes while providing little to no public services. If anything, they'd only send the police to crack down on any peasant uprisings. So basically, what you have here is a populace that hated the upper class, that despised the government, and had no hope for the future. However, something interesting happened during the 1860s, when the Kingdom of Sardinia unified Italy and Sicily became part of the new country. While this treaty promised freedom and better living conditions that never materialized, instead, Sicily found itself in an even worse position than before. There was still widespread poverty, and the people still had no say in the government. And it was because of this that secret societies started popping up all over Sicily. These groups of rebels would take it upon themselves to fight against the government and the wealthy elite. Now, some of these groups were peaceful and tried to bring about change through elections, while others took a more violent approach. Either way, they were extremely effective and grew very quickly. In fact, one of these groups, called the Carbonari, nearly overthrew the government in the early 1800s, though they failed. Their efforts inspired a new generation of Sicilians. Unfortunately, though, these new generations had no interest in freedom or democracy. Instead, they wanted revenge against anyone who was better off than them. These secret societies were made up of common folk who hated the government and the upper class. Therefore, once they joined, you were no longer judged by your social standing. Instead, you were treated equally, or at least as equal as everyone else in a secret society can be. After all, secrecy is the key ingredient to making a good mafia. But while this may sound appealing, there was a major downside. See, members of these societies weren't allowed to leave. Once you joined, you were in for life, no questions asked. Of course, that isn't surprising considering that the whole point of these societies was to hide your identity from the government. But it also made it impossible for anyone to leave the mafia, even if they wanted to. Despite that, many young Sicilians joined these societies, and one of them was a man named Matteo Manico. Now, he wasn't the most powerful nor influential member, but he came up with a brilliant idea that would change everything. You see, many of these secret societies were fighting each other for dominance, which was a terrible idea because the government could easily crush them one by one. So Matteo came up with a way to unite them all under one banner, which was the Italian word for ours, which was La Cosa Nostra. Under this banner, all differences were forgotten, and every secret society united against the common enemy, the government. Of course, this also came with a downside as well. While the government was still the main enemy, internal squabbles were now settled with violence instead of democracy. But Matteo thought that it was worth it, since uniting these gangs under one banner meant they could accomplish much more. One of those accomplishments was the creation of the mafia as we know it. With Matteo serving as its leader, or mastro, the gangs were able to launch attacks against the government and the upper class, which would go on to become known as the mafia. Now, the mafia was initially just a small-time gang of thugs, but they soon expanded into racketeering and extortion. Don't forget, Sicily is an island. The only way to transport goods to the people was by boat. And you can bet that the mafia demanded protection money from merchants to protect their shipments. Of course, they also engaged in other criminal activities as well, such as gambling and prostitution. Prostitution has been around forever, after all. But even with all that money coming in, the mafia was still seen as a low-level criminal organization. Until the US came along. Up until the early 1900s, the mafia was primarily active in Sicily. However, when the United States entered World War I, that changed everything. You see, thousands of young Italian men left Sicily to fight in the war. And when the war ended, many of them didn't return home. Instead, they chose to stay in America. It turned out that America was a land of opportunity, and many of these men wanted to make the most of it. But unfortunately, most of them had no jobs, skills, or education. Because of that, they were forced to do odd jobs or become laborers. Whatever the case, they were seen as second-class citizens and were often exploited by their employers. That's when they remembered their days back in Sicily, when they were part of the mafia, and so many of them reached out to their old friends and family back home to help them set up shop in America. In fact, many of them were actually given positions within the mafia before they even arrived. This led to a huge influx of power and manpower for the American mafia. But at first, the two sides didn't work well together. See, the Sicilian mafia was mostly focused on extortion and racket, while the American mafia wanted to focus on bigger things like bootlegging and drugs. However, once prohibition was introduced in the 1920s, both groups had a lot more in common, and so the American mafia rose rapidly. By the end of the decade, they controlled the majority of the bootlegging and drug trade in the entire country. At this point, they began to be known as La Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing. They lived up to that name by forming a sort of cartel. Every family operated independently, but they also worked together to expand their influence across the country. In fact, they did such a good job that by the 1940s, there were 5 main families who controlled the majority of the mafia business: the Bonanno crime family, the Colombo crime family, the Gambino crime family, the Genovese crime family, and the Lucchese crime family. Each of these families had control over certain parts of the country. For example, the Bonanno family was based in New York, and they specialized in gambling and loan sharking. On the other hand, the Colombo family was based in Chicago, and they specialized in narcotics trafficking. Now, these families were led by bosses, of course. The most famous boss of all was Charles Lucky Luciano, who was the boss of the Luciano crime family, and he is considered to be the father of modern-day mafia. He was the first boss to introduce accounting rules and corporate management practices to the mafia. He also helped form the Commission, which was a governing body that oversaw all the different families. So yeah, it's safe to say that the American mafia reached its peak during the mid-1900s. But as we all know, it doesn't last forever. Eventually, law enforcement caught up to them, and they've been on the decline ever since. Still, the mafia is far from gone. And if you want to learn about some of their most notorious crimes, then check out the next video.